So, shall begin. In March 1940, the electricity company Electrical Distribution of Yorkshire was engaged in a disagreement about electricity bills with Harwood House in Leeds. As you can see in this quote here, this prompted the district manager, Mr. Hayes, to write to Miss Bliss, who is the secretary at Harwood, placing the onus quite firmly on the household to keep their bills down by monitoring their use of electricity. Such disputes provide a case study to examine a point made recently by a few energy historians and scholars concerned about the impact of separating technologies of energy generation from the places they are used and from the people who are using them. The argument is that as systems get more complex, they get more opaque to users, and the starting point of the system becomes more distant from the end user, both spatially in terms of geography and experientially in terms of users' everyday experiences and perceptions. So this actually sort of feeds, as I said, into the point that Clarence is making, this broader question about invisibility of systems. We can come back to this later, perhaps. But what this means in practice is that people's conceptions of such technologies can change, as well as their patterns of use of those technologies. And this argument has been made by Richard Hirsch and Benjamin Sobokuhl in their 2012 Technology and Culture article, Wind Turbines and Invisible Technology, and recently Daniel French made this the key argument of his 2017 book, When They Hid the Fire, in the context of changing attitudes to energy production and use in the United States from the first European settlers to the early 20th century. The increasing distances between electricity generating technologies and users in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, French argues, led consumers in the US to lose sight of the use of resources, namely coal, required to generate the electricity, which was becoming more and more ubiquitous. And in this case, absence doesn't make the heart grow fonder so much as simply oblivious. This case study is a window onto the changing experiences of electricity consumption in British country houses during the period when electricity came slowly to be seen less as an expensive luxury, more as a widespread commodity. And we're focusing on Harwood House here as being representative of this period and of the discussions which large homeowners were entering into. This material is based mostly on a paper that Graham and I published and research that I did at Harwood House a couple of years ago. So, choosing electric lighting in a rural setting in early 20th century Britain often meant the requirement to be self-sufficient, and indeed self-sufficiency in electrical supply had also been commonplace in urban areas in the first few years of domestic electricity, and Graham's given a couple of examples of this in domesticating electricity. As many rural areas were not well served through this period and also afterwards, as Karen's written about, for example, large houses often supplied their own electricity, as Harwood House did when it was first electrified in 1901. This pattern of self-sufficient supply and consumption persisted due, at least in part, to remote locations, to the logistical challenges involved in running a supply from a nearby town or city. So let's focus in on Harwood House now. It's the ancestral home of the Lassells family, the Earls and Countesses of Harwood. The house was electrified under the 5th Earl, Henry Lassells. The electricity was supplied at that time, that first installation, by a turbine installed near the lake and also by an oil engine. The scheme used 2 dynamos to generate the electricity. One was powered by the turbine and the other by the engine. As well as batteries also to regulate the supply. So yes, this is a hydroelectric installation, sort of hybrid hydroelectric installation. This is quite common in this period. Large houses where a source of water exists nearby on the estate, and it provides the strong incentive of free electricity once installed. So what was being electrified? The specification document for the initial installation lists many existing light fittings which were to be converted over to electricity, mostly from a lot of these chandeliers from candles. There was a bit of gas in the gas lighting in sort of the servants' quarters, The image here is of one of the chandeliers on the ground floor of the house known as the state floor, and many of these dated back to the late 18th century. So the decision to attempt to electrify them was not taken lightly for fear of damage. This one's from the music room. It's very lovely. So let's go back to this notion introduced earlier of the proximity of the source of electrical generation to the user. So what impact did the on-site generation of Harwood's electricity have on electricity consumption? One indication of this awareness and of how consumption could be directly overseen and monitored comes from some unfortunately undated notes quoted from here on how to use the system. These are probably from about the time of the installation, and they're called Rules to be Observed for Working the Electric Installation. They note that in the event of a house party or the load to the house exceeding 40 amps, the lights must be run direct from the engine or turbine using the cells as regulators only. Now, as in other houses in this period, a close eye was kept on the use of electricity in the house, and this was planned for with the supply being regulated accordingly. Another good example of this is Cragside in Northumberland. There you go, Karen. The home of William Armstrong, where a telephone connected the butler's pantry and the engine room elsewhere on the grounds. So the butler would ring through to the man in charge of the generator when more or less electricity was required in the house. At times of lower demand, the batteries might be charged from the generator instead of supply being sent to the house, or the charge held in the batteries might be sufficient in itself to power the lights required. In the by the 1930s, by 1930, the circumstances of the Lascelles family had changed a little bit. The 6th Earl of Harwood, who had inherited the title and the house on his father's death in 1929, had a lot of personal wealth, and in 1929 had married Her Royal Highness Princess Mary, the daughter of King George V and Queen Mary, bringing Harwood a significantly increased status as a royal household. They moved into Harwood House around 1930, and it seems that switching the house over to central supply was part of the programme of modernisation undertaken by the 6th Earl. As you can see here, the first record of a payment to the supply company Electrical Distribution of Yorkshire appears in the household cash books in June 1931, and then subsequently every quarter after that. In addition, the existing plant may not have been able to supply enough power to meet the new demands which would have been placed on it by the increased use of electricity in the newly modernised house. One such case of increased consumption was the electrification in 1931 of more of the house's call bells, which we were just talking about these earlier. Some of these were already electrified, but this system was now extended. In addition, more electrical appliances were purchased and installed in this period, including vacuum cleaners and an electrical passenger lift. And this all served to increase the load on the generating plant. When the demand was expected to be higher, this required the use of the oil engine, which was expensive. All of this may have prompted the move away from self-supply and hydroelectricity. With this shift from a mainly free, sustainable supply to centralised metered consumption came something new: electricity bills. And this in turn brought a different perspective on the everyday usage of electricity in two main ways. Firstly, it provided a fixed and consistent way in which to represent costs of consumption and to compare them over time. And secondly, it gave consumers in country houses who were accustomed to organising their own supply an external authority on whom they became reliant, but also to whom they could complain and pass on the responsibility for expenses incurred. And this touches, I think, perhaps on a theme Animesh brought up in his paper, which is how the aristocracy liked to be able to blame their servants. So here you can see the cost of electricity bills for the first couple of years of external supply at Harwood House. This indicates a fairly steady pattern of consumption. In February 1940, however, the secretary, C. Bliss, who we met in our opening quote, queried a couple of previous billing requests. She thought the company had overcharged for the March 1938 bill, although a delay on the part of the company seems to have prevented this from being addressed until February 1940. And at the same time, she also queried the most recent bill from December 1939. Bliss wrote to the company saying that this required their serious attention. Why is this bill so much more than our previous bills? You need to come and have a look at this. And the company agreed. They sent a representative, the district engineer, Mr. Taylor, who looked at the daily consumption of electricity in the house over a 7-day period in March. Taylor listed the lights and other appliances in use in the house. In addition to the lights, the house also had several electric heaters and other appliances, irons, at least one wireless set, kettles, vacuum cleaners. The estimated daily cost for running all of these lights, heaters and appliances, as well as the electric lift, was given as 9 shillings and 4 pence, about £13 or so in today's money. The company then explained eventually the alleged discrepancy in billing for these different periods that Bliss had raised. Why does this cost more than that? They explained this partly by reference to the differing lengths of the different quarters. But the other part of their explanation for this extra consumption was the use of a 4-kilowatt hot cupboard in the east pantry. And if you use it more, it's going to cost you more, they say. But if your servant uses it more, it's going to cost you more. So here the company placed the responsibility for the price of energy supply back with the consumer and gave the consumer the opportunity to pass the blame on to their servants, whose responsibility it therefore was to ensure that they were not wasting the energy which was now supplied from so far away and was more difficult to monitor than it had been in the days of on-site supply. This then was the undue extravagance referred to by the company's district manager, Mr. Hayes, in our opening quote. Because households such as Harwood were used to providing their own electricity, some of it from sustainable hydroelectricity, and monitoring its generation in real time, this reliance on an external supplier took some getting used to. So, to wrap up for now, from the perspective of considering the distance between origin and use in terms of electricity supply, I think this illustrates quite nicely what I suspect probably happened more widely when users accustomed to generating their own electricity switched to centralized supply. With distance from the technologies of generation and a reduced awareness of the fuel consumption used to generate the electricity, it was easier to forget, lose track of, or simply not to think about how much electricity was being used. In the case of Harwood, they were also used to a degree of free electricity from their hydroelectric generator. Perhaps this shift resulted in a reduced ability to accurately visualize how much fuel was being consumed to generate the electricity that they were using. Something that was much easier, as we've seen just now, when everything was on site, easier to monitor, easier to keep an eye on, more aware of it. So, disconnected from the reality of the fuel used to generate the electricity, namely coal, this case study could illustrate the process by which, as historians like French argue, the consumption of coal, which was increasing dramatically in this period, was slipping into the back of consumers' minds, if it occurred at all. Perhaps, as at Harwood, so in broader society as well, the blame for consumption can always be passed around and may land on those least able to argue back, but someone will always have to pay the bill.